It turns out, sorry, I have to digress. In Canada, there's a saying that someone who is a celebrity is world famous throughout Canada. We've got the opposite problem in Piedmont. We have people who are world famous except in Piedmont, but they live here. So, I mean, Suzanne Baker was an example of that, and she's not the only example. Noelle is another example. She's the only person I've ever heard of, I'm not sure whether that's really legal, but who has won a literary prize from the Premier of Queensland and New South Wales. but they were for separate things, separate performances. Noelle is a remarkably well credentialed and rewarded writer who has lived among us in remarkable obscurity. I don't know how this is achieved, but I mean, it's characteristic of Piedmont that there are extraordinarily interesting people whom you would just pass in the street. So, Noelle, we're looking forward to hearing your account of Experiment Street, and I'll hand over.
Okay, thank you for coming, and welcome to people online. We're all getting used to this strange mix of live and online. I'm going to talk about Experiment Street, which is an audio piece that I researched and wrote for ABC Radio's The History Lesson. It went to air in 2019, and if you're interested, you can go to the website and download it and listen. I've noticed Experiment Street when I first moved to Piedmont about 14 years ago. It was the name of the street that really caught my attention. I was curious about how did it get that name. Lots of names. I live in Refinery Drive. I know why it's called Refinery. There are lots of street names that are self-evident, but Experiment Street wasn't. I walked down there, and it's the sort of street, in case you don't know, for people who don't know, it's sort of a little street near the border of Piedmont and Ultimo. What it looks like now is there are the backs of houses on Harris Street and the backs of apartments that are on Piedmont Street. So it's a sort of street of back ends, really. And come dusk, it has a slightly film noir quality. If I were going to be filming a detective series set around Sydney, Experiment Street would be one of my locations. But as I kept walking down Experiment Street, I've noticed that although the first sense is that the past is crowded out by the present, that's actually not quite true. And I wanted to find out more about it. Obviously, I wanted to know how it got that name, see if I could find that out. But I also wanted to know what kind of street was it before it became the back end of apartment buildings or houses on Harris Street. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I went about researching Experiment Street, where I went and what I did, and then a bit about some of the things that I uncovered, some of which are in the radio program and some of which aren't. There's only so much you can crowd into half an hour. The fact that it was a small, nondescript lane was what drew me in. It was where ordinary people, where poor people lived. I'm not interested in the important men of history. I'm interested in the stories and experiences of women, of migrants, of the marginalised, of people who are ignored or overlooked. The first thing I did, probably many of you have done too, is I did a deep dive into Trove, just some wonderful resource, just to see what came up. And I got a lot of things. I got lots of police, arrested people after a fight in Experiment Street, lots of scaldings of people getting burnt by boiling water kettles, sometimes deliberate, sometimes not. So that started to give me a sense of what it was, but I wanted to go beyond that. You've also looked in the State Library of New South Wales and the State Archive, material in the State Archives. If any of you've done research, I'm sure you've gone to those places as well. I always find archivists actually incredibly helpful. Like when you say, look, I'm really trying to find this out and I've got a bit of a blog, I find that they always sort of really go out of their way to find things for you and find leads. And they've often got finding guides to help researchers, to let you know, because with a lot of manuscript material, it's kind of just often in boxes, all over the place. So you need to know if there's 90 boxes on this subject. You don't necessarily want to order up and go through 90 boxes. So finding guides usually tell you a bit about what's actually in each particular box. So you can say, well, actually, I want box 23 and 32. And there's always, of course, those wonderful serendipitous discoveries that you get in those boxes, that you find something that you didn't expect to find, or sometimes I find the idea for my next piece of work from the one that I'm researching. The main place I ended up finding most materials was the City of Sydney archives, which I can highly recommend to anyone who's interested. There were some particular sources, there were lots of material information. The particular things I looked at were the city assessment books, which are records compiled by Sydney to record valuations of property. And they go from 1845 to 1948. And so that also meant it told you stuff about what the buildings were constructed of, who sort of owned it or lived there, the kind of dwelling it was. So immediately I could tell that the houses in Experiment Street were modest. They were small. They were one up, down, or two down, terraces. They tell you the use of each building, and sometimes they tell you the name of the principal occupant or what their occupation was as well, particularly the earlier records. The other place I looked is called Sands Postal Directory, and it's a sort of directory that was published from roughly the same time until the early 30s, sort of with a few years missing. And they can help you find out when streets were named, when the suburbs were divided, what people's occupations were. And they also have a kind of street listing and resident listing, and a directory of trades and companies and things. So again, it became very clear that the people who lived in Experiment Street were working in the industries on the Piedmont Peninsula of that time. There were quarrymen and shipwrights and people who were working in smelters, in the abattoirs, in those kind of occupations, builders. I want to know what were the women doing? Because most of them would have been working. Anyway, so initially I came up with the other thing that you can find out is there are kind of records of council meetings and correspondence from the council. And that's where I started to get the material about how Experiment Street got its name. So there's a lot of information about Sydney street names in the City of Sydney. The first mention I dug up was a road construction plan dated February 1881. It soon became clear that probably Experiment Street was named around that time, probably in a nod to Experiment Farm by the Harris family. But it's not the only possibility. There were convict ships, there were two convict ships that came into Sydney, one in 1804, one I think by 1809. They were both called Experiment. And in a sort of a port area, which Piedmont was, it wasn't uncommon to name a street after a ship that came in. The first one, 1804, was a big female convict ship. Anyway, from that, so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. But when I started cross-referencing the SANS and the assessment records and the council records, I found that it was known as Experiment Lane early on. But there was another name. For a little part of its sort of biography, Experiment Street was called Henson Street. And I only sort of stumbled across that really by accident, by noticing something and thinking, what's that? And sort of pulling that thread to see where it might take me. The houses in Experiment Street were built really from the early 1880s through that decade. They were only built along one side of the street because the other street, as is now, was the back of the houses on terraces on Harris Street. So the houses were built numbers 2, eventually to 84, even numbers only along the one side of Experiment Street, where the backs of the apartments are now. It was only known as Henson Street really early on, quite briefly. And I kept wondering, well, why Henson Street? Where did that come from? The best clue I could find, without endlessly getting absolutely lost in archival records, was that there was a family of builders called Henson around in Sydney at that time. And it's very likely that at least some of the houses there were built by Henson family builders. And it would be quite common for whoever was doing the building to give the street a name. That's my sort of best guess for where Henson Street. It didn't last very long as Henson Street. And it also then at some point changed from Lane. It was initially Lane, which of course has all the associations of the Dunny Lane and other kind of less savoury associations. So in the city, the minutes of the council from 1896, I think it's 1888, no, 1896, sorry. There was a petition from sort of the residents and owners of Experiment Lane to change its name to Hamden Street, Hampden. Where they got Hamden from, I don't know. Again, there's no mention. The letter is there in the council meetings. It's kind of faded ink paper, the colour of milky coffee. A lot of the correspondence is about drains and such like. If you really want to know a lot about drains, this early correspondence is where to go. Lots of it focused on drains and not surprisingly, issues of sanitation, of typhoid disease, but sanitation. Anyway, in 1896, the residents and occupants of Experiment Street wrote to the council requesting to change the name because they felt the name reflected poorly on them as residents, Experiment Lane. The council didn't give in to that request, and they didn't explain why Hampton. I think it sort of maybe has something respectability that they were looking for. But they did agree for it to become Experiment Street, not Experiment Lane. So that's when it became Experiment Street. So I got all that. I got that material, and I was also, looking particularly for stories about it, about people who lived there. Some strange stories. I found some wonderful things that really wasn't much time to put in the audio, but things that it hosted a free love sect in the 1920s. Took sort of refuge in Experiment Street, or part of it did, following a sort of scandalous murder case. But because I was looking for the stories of women, the stories of people and migrants, not the obvious stories about the famous faces of history, and especially looking for people who were not from Anglo-Celtic backgrounds. So I came across stories like one I came across was described as Noni Thomas, who was extraordinarily badly beaten up in 1930. She was described as a coloured girl, which I presume meant she wasn't Indigenous because they would have probably described her differently. So that kind of intrigued me. I thought, well, who was she? I tried to find out more. There were no court records of that time that I could access readily. All I could find out was that she was 16 years old and very badly beaten up in Experiment Street. As I said, there were lots of scaldings, brawls, lots of people, often religious figures, decrying the squalor and immorality. There's a wonderful piece in Truth about bellicose females always in Experiment Street spoiling for a fight. It's very entertaining reading, but quite sad in a way too. But it's obviously deeply exaggerated. But they talk about the squalor and the immorality of the inner city generally, and not always with much understanding or compassion. These were sort of humble dwellings of working people who really didn't have a lot of money. There were a lot of people crowded into quite small places. So I thought there were a lot of domestic accidents. I couldn't find, one of the places I looked for, tried to find photographs, early photographs. I couldn't find any photographs of Experiment Street. I think it was too insignificant to have been photographed. There are other photographs of Piedmont around at the same time, and there are photographs of 2 up, 2 down little terraces in, I think, Jones Street, which is probably very much what Experiment Street houses would have looked like. The only photograph I could find is a not great one from 1979 to the City of Sydney archives. But I also found out things like number 36 Experiment Street was a shop for a number of years until the early 30s. It was run by a Mr. and Mrs. Collier and then by a Mrs. Collier. And so imagine these were really small. It would have been just like the basics like jam, bread, rice, flour, those kind of things. One of the other stories that I came across was, I suppose, thinking as well, not that Experiment Street exists not only in archival documents, but also in neighbourhood folklore, in remnants of buildings, and in stories like that of Joyce Howe, her Indian fiancé Fazil Saad, and the 1931 wedding that never was. There's quite a lot about this story. Joyce Howe was in her teens. She fell in love with a gentleman from the Indian subcontinent who was working on a ship and planned to get married. So their first attempt to get married, she was staying with another family called the Fazildads, Mrs. Daisy Fazildad, who was from Hay in New South Wales, and her husband William, who was from Rawalpindi in what's now Pakistan, who lived at number 16 Experiment Street in early 30s. And so Joyce was staying with them, and they went to first one church where the vicar there refused to marry them because he wasn't convinced that Mr. Saad, her fiance, was a Christian, not a Muslim, and he wasn't convinced that she had her parents' permission to marry, so she must have been under 18. So that didn't work. So they all went back. The bride collapsed in the sort of method of tears and white silk, and they all went back to the Fazildads at number 16, where a whole wedding feast had been arranged to presumably mourn or celebrate. And they were going to go and get married the next morning at the registration. Another religious outfit also refused to marry them. And eventually, or fairly soon afterwards, Fazil Saad's ship sailed, so the wedding never happened. And Joyce really didn't come to a very happy end. She was described as wayward and a bad girl. And she was taken to Long Bay to protect her from herself, which is a really sad story about Joyce, who her sort of family disowned her. No one really wanted to know her. After her being taken to Long Bay and put in, like, essentially sectioned under a psychiatric order, she disappears from the public record. I think we can assume she probably wasn't the happy ending she was hoping for. But I guess one of the things that interested me is that early Australia, no 1930s and early Australia, but even earlier, was much more multicultural than we're ever led to believe. Early Australia, there were people from Armenia, there were Jews on the First Fleet, there were people from Greek backgrounds, from Polish backgrounds, from Russian backgrounds. It was a lot more culturally diverse than the picture we're often presented with in traditional history, it was solidly Anglo-Celtic with the odd person. When I was researching another radio piece a few years ago about Johann Lotsky, who came originally from one of those parts of Europe which was constantly being shuffled around between Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, Poland. He came to Sydney and Tasmania in the 1930s, and he was a sort of a fantastic polyglot, spoke multiple languages. But when I was researching him, there were a whole lot of other people who came from different backgrounds that we don't really know about. So I just always liked, I think that always fuels my interest in finding out the stories of the people who are often not on the official records, or the people who, it's just a little mention of a name and then they move on. Just based in the people and stories rather than the official records. The slum clearance of the 1930s affected Experiment Street. It was targeted as, a terrible place. There were a lot of protests helped by sort of the Communist Party and other groups to try and protest against that. But the councillors really had decided that there was this big slum clearance, not only in Pyrmont, but in other parts of inner city. They were going to knock down all these houses, which they did throughout the 1930s. By the sort of end of that decade, the domestic houses were all gone in Pyrmont. In 1937, on that side of the street, they built sort of warehouses and factories. And in 1937, a factory was built at the corner of Pyrmont and Experiment Streets for the Amalgamated Drug and Cosmetic Corporation. And I'm really interested in this company. They were very idealistic. They had The building was designed with sort of Art Deco and a lot of glass bricks, and it featured in architecture and design magazines as a kind of shining example of contemporary design. The people who set up the company obviously had great regard for their workers. They provided lots of recreation area with light-filled rooms for them to eat their lunch and a whole lot of things. It was there was a definite philosophy underpinning that view. And so they were idealistic. They made a product called Salda Seltzer, which was, as far as I can see, a local version of Alka-Seltzer. 12 months after that company moved into its newly purpose-built facility, it went bust. There's a real dearth of information about this company, so if anyone finds out any more about this company, please let me know. As far as I can tell, the American manufacturer of Alka-Seltzer sued them for Salda Seltzer, and that's probably what put an end to that company. But it had such a short period, and it was so sort of idealistic, and it had this beautiful building. That's kind of apartments now. But if you actually go onto Piermont Street and look at the corner where Allen Street and Piermont Street meet, you can still see some Art Deco traces in the architecture of that building. There was once the Amalgamated Drug and Cosmetic Corporation. Again, it's one of those stories of just how things disappear, that are kind of brief life and disappear, and what happens to them. I suppose the American historian Daniel Richter draws a kind of geological analogy in talking about history, and he talks about the layers of the past that remain in the present, like strata. And sometimes that's in the names of something, sometimes it's in bits of a wall or bits of an architectural detail. So often when you look at somewhere, you can see there are all these sort of layers if you look carefully. So walking up and down Experiment Street today, you can see those parts. The wool stores are now home to apartments, cafes, startups. And the pub around the corner, on the corner of Piermont and Allen, which was once the Wool Brokers Arms, because the wool stores were the big thing in Piermont, that's now a backpacker hostel. So lots of things change about Experiment Street, but it still fascinates me. Still, there's lots more stories that sort of you can excavate from that place. But I think I'll stop there and go over to questions. Does anyone know anything about the Amalgamated Drug and Cosmetic Corporation?
Where did you say it was? In the corner of?
The building was originally on the corner of Piermont and Allen Street,
Yeah.
and its back was onto Experiment Street. So it was in that Piermont Street, Experiment Street, and Allen Street on that corner.
Next to that Wool Brokers Arms.
Sort of, kind of just a bit further along.
So I can walk down there all.
Yeah, it is still. You can still see a little bit of that Art Deco architecture that was once that factory, but obviously it's been completely remodeled into apartments now.
I wondered, Noelle, if you'd like to say anything. I'd be interested to know more about your research. You talked about the research, which is fascinating, and the kind of stories you were drawn to. I wondered if you'd like to say anything about your approach as a writer to selecting and dramatising that material to construct your portrait of Experiment Street.
Okay. Yes. I've just turned that on. I've just turned it on.
Yeah, when you turn it on, so it should be. So,
It's on.
sorry.
Yes, I did. I suppose I think I used my background's been primarily as sort of playwright and poet. And so I often use my dramatist skills to animate the archive, to bring it to life, the archival record, and to evoke the era. So in this, I decided I wanted to have a narrator. And I wanted a flexibility, so the narrator could be talking about 1882, or she could be talking about 2019. So obviously there was going to be a fictional narrator, but I think of it as a fiction based in fact narrator. And I wanted her to be sort of female, and there were a lot of, around Experiment Street, there were a lot of women who were widows, partly the result of First World War, but also a huge number of industrial accidents made people into widows as well. So I thought, okay, she's a widow. She'd probably be doing whatever she could to support kids and a family. So she'd have to use whatever skills she had. So I made her a seamstress. So I sort of looked around and sort of picked up a name. So I created this character called Lizzie Absalom, who was, I think of as a fiction based in fact character. And so she could talk about things, you know, I remember that from 1921, I remember that from 1950, because she was a fictional creation. She's introduced as a fictional creation, but she is the sort of linchpin that kind of holds the narrative together, because there are all sorts of other things. I use quotes. All the other texts, apart from Lizzie Absalom's, are actually things that are on the historical record, although I've edited them for concision and clarity. But they're actually all material from the historical record, apart from Lizzie's lines, who was brought wonderfully to life by Jeanette Cronin in the piece. So it was then made with a producer and a sound designer, Ros Blewett and Russell Stapleton, with whom I shared the Premier's History Prize this year, for digital history. And they brought, well, I write also with a lot of sound and kind of sound snippets of things, but they add to that as well. And so we had all the snippets with three other actors reading all the different bits. But Lizzie Absalom was the sort of the narrator. And it was actually very liberating to do, create a sort of fiction based in fact narration. She says at one point in the piece, "You won't find me on the official record, but I could be. There were plenty like me in Experiment Street." But yeah, there were a lot of widows and seamstresses and women doing that kind of piecework.
What about their condition? Did they own their house? Did they rent it? Were there banks? And get any sense of the industrial history? Like in the 1920s, lots of strikes going on.
They would nearly all be tenants living there. What happened is that various companies or landowners bought whole blocks of housing and rented them out. They were absentee landlords. So they didn't really maintain the properties very well. They'd have blocks here, blocks there, lots of them all over Sydney. So the people were poor people, working in pretty poorly paid, insecure jobs with high rates of accidents. Nobody in Experiment Street, practically nobody would own their house. They were all owned, there were blocks of them. If you look at the records of ownership, there are blocks of them owned by individual landowners. And if you look at those individual landowners, they own blocks in other parts of town as well. And most people who lived there would work locally. They worked. I mean, the big thing, which I think is when Shirley Fitzgerald came and spoke here a while back, was about pubs. And we all know from living in Pyrmont, there are a lot of pubs, or even if they're not all pubs now, in the area. And that each professions have their own. And they were much part of the difference between the public and private life was differently drawn from the way it is now. So people would actually, if you had something large to cook, you wouldn't cook it in your own place. You'd take it to the pub, you'd have a big oven, and they'd cook it for you and bring it back. And that was quite common, that kind of exchange. So it was much more integrated into the community life. So when the council decided to sort of knock them all down in the 30s, it was incredibly sad, because they're actually destroying a very close-knit community. And some of those social bonds, and we all know that Pyrmont sort of went into a bit of a decline after that, and only sort of fortunately has all come back now with a sense of community. But yeah, and people worked in the local things. Like initially it would have been quarries, then there were train drivers, and there definitely was the strike of 1917 was quite big among people. A lot of the people were on strike, or were not on strike, but most of them in Experiment Street were part of that strike. Again, in half an hour, there's only so much I could put into the program without being completely overwhelmed. So that's probably another program about the general strike.
What about the free love scene? Is that an aberration? Or?
No, I mean, it was a place where a lot of people sort of took refuge or hid out. I mean, the cops were quite often in Experiment Street in the early part of last century, kind of, patrolling, beating people up as well in some cases. There was a guy called Strong Andrew, who known locally as Strong Andrew, who was there. There was also a gang, and names completely out of my head, but there was a sort of a gang that had a rather wonderful name based in Piedmont in the 20s. The Spider Gang, yes, the Spider Gang, that's it. So there was kind of, there were a lot of things that, are not in the program that you could make another program. But there were people who were on the run or hiding out or kind of wanted to stay under the radar. That was quite common. There was sort of, of course it's hard to find records of them now, but yes, there's that sense in which it was a refuge for people. People hid out there.
The impression I got from other parts of Piedmont is that many of these blocks of houses were owned by city councillors.
Yes, they were.
But one of the main drivers for lump sum clearance was the need for more wool stores. And what wool stores could pay for a block of houses was just too tempting to.
Yeah. Because it was also one of the other things that was giving me an effective experience was the big fire of the Goldsboro building in 1935 as well. Like there's amazing accounts of all these kind of dead pigeons dropping from the sky after the smoke. I mean, they were worried that it was going to go into Experiment Street, and residents were, the last part of the houses were already being knocked down, but the last of the residents there were all evacuated. Fortunately, it didn't, but not that it would have made much difference because those houses were all going anyway.
Thanks, Noelle. I've lived in Piedmont about 15 years and not far from Experiment Street. I'm in Murray Street. And I've never actually walked down Experiment Street. It's just really boring. As you say, it's just backs on the houses, the terraces from Harris Street and the backs of the very plain sort of apartments. So coming here this afternoon, I actually did the first time 15 years old on it. And I listened to your podcast this afternoon and I just loved it. And just walking into what otherwise would have been a really boring street, when we did this podcast, we really brought that to life. So thanks for doing that. One of the things which I found yesterday in the podcast, and alluded to it, and spoke about it this afternoon, is about the gentleman from Rawalpindi and the failed marriage and all that. Yeah, I had no idea as well how multicultural Chinese, of course, is in the Goldfields and much of the Haymarket. But anything beyond that, in certain terms of the subcontinent, of course, that was part of Sydney, so I was really surprised about it.
Yeah. And actually there was quite a strong presence in Sydney of people who come from the Indian subcontinent, where it might be now Pakistan or Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, or also from Malaysia. Yeah, sometimes it takes a while because names get particularly if they're coming from a language that doesn't use the same alphabet, they get transliterated in different ways, whether it's from Chinese or Arabic script. So they you can see it takes a while to work out, actually that's the same person. They've just transliterated the surname differently. So it's a bit of a...
Do you come across any photos of terraces which would have been...
No, I couldn't find any at all. The only photograph I could find of Experiment Street came from 1979. There were photographs of other terraces, streets in Piedmont from around that time, and there's one of I think it's Jones Street, that's kind of like 2 up, 2 down little terraces, and I think that's probably very similar to what the houses in Piedmont in Experiment Street would have looked like. But no, unfortunately not. I mean, hopefully, maybe some will come to light. Some people have got some old photos in their sort of basements or things, but no, there aren't. Not that I could find anyway. Maybe a deeper dive into state records and things might get something, but that's get lost, get into a kind of research fever. And
thank you, Noelle, for that wonderful talk. Just a comment and question. The company that you were interested in probably would have been incorporated under the old New South Wales Companies Act, and it would have been wound up on a motion to the Supreme Court to the Equity Division of the Supreme Court, and due to be backed up by an affidavit explaining the company's rise and fall. And I don't know where the records of the Supreme Court go, but they probably go somewhere safe, probably the state archives.
Probably the state archive.
Yeah. The question is this the end of your interest in experiments? I mean, have you dug deep enough, or is it still a living thing for you?
Oh, look, I'll always have a very soft spot for Experiment Street. I had it from the moment we first, came to Piermont. I noted that street, the name. I really liked it. I like experiments in all sorts of areas. I like experiments in writing. I like experiments in cooking. I like experiments in life. So immediately I honed in on that name. So yeah, I don't think it'll completely go away. But it's like with everything, you have to move on to the next work. I mean, when I wrote about thistles, for a long time after that, people sent me huge numbers of photographs of thistles or little bits of information about thistles. I think that's kind of fortunately died off now, so maybe Experiment Street will take over. There are probably thistles growing in Experiment Street somewhere.
Merchandising.
It occurs to me also that the convict ships didn't discriminate against West Indians.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, so
They picked them up from.
yeah, so they may well have been overrepresented in terms of population in the convict ships.
Yeah. I mean, that was when I thought about Noelle Thomas. I thought, was she a descendant of someone who had been brought from the Caribbean? And actually, when I did the research on Jan Lotsky, he was given, which is the 1830s in Tasmania, he was given some African slaves that were brought from there in Hobart. So again, there was a Pan-African presence in Hobart in the 1830s. And you don't really ever hear much about them.
And as we'll discover next week, there were a large number of South Sea Islanders around here as well.
Yeah, yes.
In your research, was there any sort of books that you referenced to?
In your research, was there any books that referenced sort of contemporary history of film? Contemporary.
Well, there was sort of ones that are known. There's sort of Piermont and Ultimo. What was Shirley Fitzgerald and someone else wrote, which was I think really from about the 80s. There's a lot of stuff about the Piermont in the 80s and the push for redevelopment. There's also Shirley's book about the Terminus Hotel. Book about street names of Sydney, which has, but you can, a lot of that you can get through the City of Sydney archives. And then there were kind of wonderful tracts I found from a reverend from about, I think, 1914, who was absolutely sort of vitriolic, foaming at the mouth about the immorality of people, particularly women, of course, living in slums and and the terrible conditions. So there were tracts like that, historical things. I also came across a story called Christmas Eve in Experiment Street. It was written by Corrie, and again I can't remember her name. It's in the program. It was published in about 1921, and it's a story of domestic violence in Experiment Street. So it had that kind of reputation. So there were things that I discovered in that. There weren't sort of books per se. There's of course books about the history of the quarries in Piermont. But again, looking because I was interested not in the kind of the official histories, I was interested in the stories of the people who fell through the gaps in the record or were never recorded anyway, or the people that we might not think about. So I was always scanning for sort of non-Anglo names, and then pulling that through. I mean, it's something that another American historian, Robert Darnton, talks about, following the richest run of material wherever it leads you, which I really like that. That you think you're working on something because and then you sort of keep getting pulled in this direction, and eventually you go, I have to go in this direction because that material is just completely absorbing. Yeah.
Thanks, Noelle. That was terrific. And so is the podcast. I'm interested in the technology of the podcast and its capacity for giving people information about history, about our history, which is different. I suppose I'm talking about a different audience from the audience for books, the audience for websites, and whether you've had any feedback about the value of that podcast giving people a sense of, certainly when we listened to it, we felt, yes, we understood some more about that time in that place. I'm a great admirer of historical fiction. I don't read history, although I've been married to historians all my life, but I do read historical fiction. And I'm sure people know much more about that period of time in England through reading Hilary Mantel than they'll ever find out from any other source. But what about podcasts? Are they incredibly difficult to produce? Do you need to be a dramatist to write the basis of, is that what, it sounds as if that's what you did with your story. Is there the potential for more podcasts, for more aspects of Piemont's history? And how might we, in which direction might we look to develop that as an idea of how you spread the word about history, which isn't in books and isn't on the website?
So I think that's a really good question, and I think podcasts are having a bit of a moment. And there's lots of different things, you know, like some podcasts are incredibly simple. There are some that are just someone speaks for sort of 7 or 8 minutes, and they've got really interesting things to say, and you listen to it, and then there's another one. And then there are other ones that are sort of produced, which is like Experiment Street. There's a lot of audio effects, there's bits of music, there are actors in voices in that one. But they don't have to be like that. Some really good podcasts are incredibly simple and can be just a person speaking, sometimes with a bit of audio. So you can actually, I mean, you can make one on your iPhone if you want to. The thing often with podcasts is distribution. How do you access them? I mean, obviously I had the resources of the ABC on the history listen on that. So I had a producer to work with and a co-producer and a sound designer who sort of did all the mixing of things, and you know, together we'd go, well, shall we put that in there? Shall we use a bit of that music for that, or shall we save that and use it with this, or let's signal that, or let's have, you know, a whole lot of technical stuff. I think podcasts are great. I love listening to, actually, when I'm cooking, putting on a podcast and listening to a podcast on my iPad while I'm making dinner. You know, all sorts of things. But I think there can be lots of different things. And I think there's no reason why Piedmont History wouldn't have a sort of podcast series of maybe pick different streets, different things, or whatever it is, and do a kind of a series about Piedmont history or different aspects of Piedmont history. And they can be quite simple. Maybe the relationship that you have, the society has with students at UTS. I mean, UTS teaches a lot of audio and making the program. So maybe some of the people in there could provide some of the technical skills that are needed. I mean, I don't do the technical stuff myself. I'm a writer, researcher and writer. So I do the script, but then I'm involved in the production. So, you know, I cast the actor and directed the actor who's played Lizzie Absalom. And I've put in a lot of production stuff, but you could make it very simply. So yes, but I think it does open out to a different audience. And I think it's certainly true that what you say about, you know, people know about the sort of Cromwellian era from Hilary Mantel, or, you know, people know about, you know, often about historical events through reading fiction or poetry or films or dramas that are set in those eras. I think the whole thing between the line between fiction and history, that's a whole other big debate, kind of not for today. But yeah, I think there's definitely potential for making podcasts, for the Piedmont History Group to make podcasts.
I would like us to stop at this moment and become less formal.
Yeah.
But first, I've got to congratulate you not only on the podcast itself, but on the enchanting way in which you've introduced it to us and to the whole idea of podcast. I mean, this has been a revelation, and we're very grateful for the insight that you've given us into a whole range of things, possibly wider than you had imagined. So thank you for that.